Liza Lawrence here with episode 5, Cardiac Ridge. Welcome to Wonders and Miracles podcast, where we celebrate miraculous moments in everyday lives. I'm your host, Liza Lawrence, a wife, mother, teacher, and miracle lover. If you're new to this podcast, here's what we do here. Each week on Miracle Monday, we celebrate awe-inspiring true stories from regular people like you and me. People who have experienced something surprising and wonderful that could be considered the work of a divine source. My desire is to help us recognize God's hand and His love in our lives. Because the more miracles we notice, the more miracles happen. Thanks for listening to the show. Now let's celebrate wonders and miracles together. Spencer W. Kimball said, "God does notice us, and He watches over us, but it is usually through another person that He meets our needs." In this episode, we get to hear the same story from two different perspectives. We're going to hear it first from a friend watching on, and one from the man experiencing cardiac arrest. This is a powerful miracle story with personal messages from the Lord that will really touch your heart. But first, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Meditations on the Mount. These are Bible-based meditations that my family's been using for years, and yes, it does help that my husband and I created them, but truly, they are wonderful. If you've ever longed for ways to feel God's love, peace, or stillness in your life, Meditations on the Mount can help. We also have a Meditations on the Mount for children. I'm a child educator, and I saw the need for children to learn the power of meditation. It's interesting, this week we had a fun email come into our inbox, and it was from Sue Wan, and they said, "I always liked meditation, but I also felt that it was more near Eastern religions, and as a Christian, I drifted somehow away from it. So I'm glad you're shedding some wisdom on this important topic and connecting it to the Bible." So on meditationsonthemount.com, there's also a meditation course you can take and learn about Christian meditation, how it works. You get the full album with that course. So check that out. You might really enjoy that class that Meditations on the Mount offers. So I'm excited to get started. Hope you enjoy this episode. So I'm here with my brother-in-law, Tony, from Idaho, who has a miracle story about kind of a hike that he went on. It's an amazing story. So thanks for being on the show, Tony.
Thanks for having me, Liza. This story is probably one of the highlights of my life as far as being in a situation that you look back and there's just, how could it have gone any better? I'm a horticulturalist by trade, and for the last 10 years, I've worked with the University of Idaho, a colleague of mine, and we have traveled all over the western mountains, looking for native plants to domesticate so we can use them in landscape projects and in the landscape industry. While we were up in the Frank Church Wilderness, which is in central Idaho, and we were looking for native plants in an area that is uninhabited and there's no roads going in and back into this natural preserve. And as we were only actually about 3 to 4 miles up into the trail, but even the road going in, we had no cell service. I mean, it is really remote. As we were hiking, my friend started to complain that...
So who were you hiking with? How many people were you hiking with?
There were 4 of us all together, and that's actually one of the miracles. It was only supposed to be 3 of us, 2 colleagues from Eastern Idaho and myself. And then this gentleman asked if he could tag along and learn about what we were doing. It just so happened, and this is part of the miracle, it just so happened that he had recently retired from being an ER doctor of about 15 to 20 years. And so we had a specialist on hand. But as I was saying, we were shortly into this hike. It was quite an incline to begin with, and more than normal, one of my colleagues was really struggling. He had to take quite a few breaks, and so we started to get kind of concerned. At about mile 3, we sat him down. We were on this ridge, which has since been called Cardiac Ridge, so you can guess what was going on with my dear friend. He was having a heart attack in the middle of absolutely nowhere on a sheer cliff. So we were on this ridge line. Once our friend, the doctor, identified you're having a heart attack, we quickly went through our packs to try to find some aspirin. That's a blood thinner, so it would help. No one had any aspirin. I luckily had some Pepto-Bismol, and I wouldn't know this, but the doctor said this is very closely related to aspirin. And so we gave him the Pepto-Bismol. While they were doing that, I ran up with my cell phone just to see if there was some miracle chance. Only about halfway up the mountain, I checked, and I had 2 bars on my phone. And I called 911. I had my GPS there, so I gave him the GPS coordinates of where we were. I said, our friend is having a heart attack. We cannot move him. He's resting. We have him lying down. He's still breathing, but he is having some problems. At that point, I was concerned. I said a little prayer, and I decided that I needed to call his wife, and just to let her know what was going on. And I was able to call his wife up on the ridge. After that, I went back down the mountain.
And what did his wife say when you called her? What did you tell her, and what was her response?
I told her that her husband needed her prayers. And so to send the word that family, we need prayers for my husband. And so anyway, that started a chain of events. She immediately knew that he probably would be life flighted to Boise, being the closest. If indeed we were able to get a helicopter out there. So she just started driving from eastern Idaho to Boise to try to be there. But anyway, we said a prayer around him, and we prayed that he would be able to maintain consciousness until he arrived at a medical facility that would be able to treat him. And that's kind of where we left it. And it was really interesting that the ER doctor was an atheist, and then the other 3 of us were pretty religious. So he was kind of sitting there, kind of watching. This whole time, Steve is breathing. We keep checking for pulses. We're having a tough time finding a pulse.
Was he conscious at this time?
Yes, Steve was conscious the whole time. In fact, a few times he was joking with us. So we're waiting. We're sitting down in this little camp, this little miracle camp, and all of a sudden my phone rings. And it is the dispatch. And they said, we are lost. We can't find the trailhead. And we're like, there's a bunch of trucks at the trailhead. They couldn't find us. And they ran into a couple roads where they had to get out chainsaws to cut logs. And we're like, you're on the wrong road. And we're like, why didn't you send a helicopter where there's no place to land? And they couldn't find you. We didn't hear a helicopter. We gave them our GPS coordinates. So all these things were going wrong. This is midnight. Okay, good. We've been up there a long time.
How many hours would you say?
At this time, we're probably 8 hours in. He is still lying. We having to keep moving him because he's starting to hurt. He's been laying on the ground that long. We're getting really nervous it's taking this long. And the doctor is saying, this isn't good. Like every hour, part of his heart continues to die. This is not good at all. So we're getting really nervous that this is not going to end well. And the doctor isn't helping because he's been through this. He knows. He's seen too much to even guess that Steve's going to come out of this alive. While we're sitting there, of course, the stars are coming out. And the atheist starts to ask me questions, me and this other guy, as we stare at the stars. And he says, what do you believe about the stars? And we had some really interesting conversations as we discussed our purpose. What is this whole experience that we're experiencing right now? What does it mean? Why is this happening to us? And why would God make this happen if there is a God? So it was just a really interesting conversation. And we had some time to think about those things. And about then, we started seeing lights down the trail. So the flashlights started coming. Once they got up there, they set up flashers. They looked around. They're like, there is nowhere to land a helicopter. And at that point, they had a helicopter waiting. And once they figured out they couldn't land, they had to call up, I think it was Missoula, because that's the only place they had a helicopter with a lift.
Wow.
So now we have to wait another 2 hours for the helicopter to get down from Missoula that has this special team to be able to strap Steve in and lift him out to carry him down to the helicopter that's down in Cascade. And it just craziness. Wow. So anyway, 2 hours later, it's 2 a.m. There's the medical team's there. They've given him some shots. They're starting to work on him. He is really, really struggling at this point. He's still conscious. He's still, joking, but he doesn't look well. And he's saying he doesn't remember a lot of this. So I think he was blacking out. But all of a sudden there's this little UFO sitting above us. And this little green guy floats out of and he's dressed in green, so you can see him fluorescent. And he drops down, and then the doctors, they lift up Steve and they walk him over to the helicopter. They strap him into a harness. And then he and the green guy float up into the UFO, and it goes away. And it was the craziest dust storm you've ever seen. The rest of the story goes like this. One miracle after the next. Steve did make it to Boise. And once he got to Boise, he did pass out and had a massive heart attack, which he died for several minutes. Yeah. They revived him, and realizing the stents were not going to hold in his heart, they life flighted him to Salt Lake, where he went through massive heart surgery. Just 2 months ago, we were out hiking. Again, this was a couple years ago, and just 2 months ago, we were out hiking in the Waihe Desert of Idaho, looking for native plants, and we have already scheduled trips for next year. Right now, he's on the heart transplant list. He wears a little heart meter that basically acts as his heart, pumps blood for him. But an absolute miracle. Sorry, I missed this. Remember that phone call that came in, and I wasn't on the ridge. It came in right in that little camp from dispatch saying, "Where are you?" Right after that phone call, his wife called and was able to talk to him. Wow. That was a miracle. That ridge was the only ridge the rest of the trip that we had cell service. There was no other ridge, and I kept trying to send a text or to get anything. There was not a spot the rest of our 4 days of hiking that we had cell service. And it wasn't until I got back to that ridge that I was able to find out what had happened. How bad was it?
And if he survived.
And even if he survived, we really didn't know. But I had seen too many miracles in that 24-hour period to doubt that he wouldn't live through it.
So what do you think was the key to him surviving?
I think it was a mixture of, my first instinct was, you had a bad Subway sandwich. That was my first instinct. We had a doctor that immediately was able to identify what was going on, and we immediately had him sit down, rest, and tried to find something that would work.
So the fact that this doctor just decided to go on this trip was a miracle in and of itself. He wasn't planning on coming. So that was the first miracle, if you will.
Yeah. And him being an atheist, to help him try to see, do you even realize that you played a part in this amazing miracle? And I haven't really been able to talk to him since knowing Steve survived. But that in itself was such a blessing, to have somebody that knew so much quickly identify it. And then just the miracle of being able to have cell service in that area, where it would have put us in a really bad situation to try to get him down, to try to keep moving him. That could have made things really bad. The miracle is that Steve is a walking miracle, that he survived something. Those that really understand cardiac arrest, you may have heard of the Widowmaker. That's what happened. That's like 85% mortality rate, 90% mortality rate. There's people just don't walk away from that. And being on a mountain for 10 hours, going through a slow process of cardiac arrest, that's crazy. And he survived it.
You mentioned that the three of you prayed together, and then you asked his wife to pray and call for family to pray. What role do you think prayer had in this?
Absolutely. The blessings of prayer were very pronounced in because it wasn't just one single prayer. It was multiple prayers. It was me praying on the mountain that I would be able to make a phone call. It was his wife and his family praying immediately upon hearing that, okay, something's wrong. I think the prayers with the three of us and the atheist watching on, when I say he prayed with us, he watched on. I know he experienced it with us, though. And however he interprets it, he experienced it with us, and he was part of that miracle.
Yeah. I love that story. Thank you for sharing, Tony. And I just really love all the the little, we would maybe call them coincidences, but they're not, that the hand of God is in everything.
Thanks for having me, Liza.
So our next guest is Steve from Idaho, and I'm really grateful for his willingness to be on the show because he's going to share his experience with us of the same event that we just heard from Tony. So Steve, tell us what it was like from your point of view and what you experienced during this time.
Well, as Tony mentioned, we were on a plant hunting foray back into the Frank Church Wilderness area. If you're not familiar with that area, it is the most remote geographical area in the lower 48 states. It's not very hard to get far away from everything. Mm-hmm. We were very far away from civilization when this incident happened. Just let me lead up to this by introducing myself a little bit. I work for the University of Idaho. I've always been very active physically. One of the things I do is for the university is go back into these wilderness areas and do these plant forays. I've always had good health, never had any problems or issues. In fact, the week before this particular trip, I went on an earlier foray into the same part of the country and hiked about 10-mile round trips, about 3,000 foot elevation gain. Felt great. Was able to keep up with my 35-year-old technician. I was doing well. By the way, I'm at this point in time, I had just turned 60 years old.
Okay.
So anyway, that's where we were at, and we put a team together of 4 people, and we took off on this hike. I was really looking forward to this trip. There were actually 3 of us, University of Idaho employees, that were initially going on this trip. Just at the very last moment, a gentleman that I know from the Idaho Native Plant Society called and said, "I heard you were going on a foray. I'd really like to go with you if you'd take me." He says, "I just retired and I'm looking for some things to do." And so I talked to him a little bit to make sure that he had the background to do something like this without issue. And I said, "Sure, come along." Turns out that he had just retired as an emergency room physician. Mm-hmm. That was the first miracle of this particular incident.
That you had a doctor on board.
That I had a doctor on board, and he definitely had a hand, in fact, in my survival. In fact, he probably saved my life through this process. So anyway, we took off, got up into the trailhead area, way up into the national forest in Idaho, unloaded and started hiking up the ridges on the way to a lake that we were hiking into. And about a mile into the trip, I started feeling a little bit tired. I didn't have really any symptoms other than that. I was just having a little bit of a hard time keeping up with the crew, and I shouldn't have. I was in good condition. I was in as good a condition as the rest of the crew. Mm-hmm. And I just had to stop occasionally and say, "Hey, hold up just for a second. Let me take a little breather." And then we'd continue. And after we got about 2 miles into the hike, by this time we were up on a very rocky high ridge at about 9,000 feet. I just said, I'm struggling. I don't know what's wrong. The physician that was with us, he was a little bit out ahead of us and saw that I was having some issues, and he came back to check things out, and he took one look at me and he says, "You're having a heart attack."
Wow. He just knew, huh?
He just knew because of the experiences that he had in the emergency room. I said, that can't be right. I'm having no symptoms of a heart attack. I'm just having energy issues. I just can't quite keep up with you guys. And I'm having no pain. I'm having none of the symptoms that you read about that would indicate a heart attack. He looked at me right in the eye and he says, "You are having a heart attack." He says, "We don't have many tools here, but the only thing we can do is get you off your feet and make sure you don't stress your heart any further, and then get you some help." And so he laid me down right there, which happened to be on a big pile of sharp rocks. And he said, "I don't want you moving from this spot." And then he started the process of trying to get some help. He sent Tony and the other guy that was with us onto the ridge up higher to seek cell service. And recognize that we were probably 40 miles from the nearest cell repeater. I don't know that they had any hope that they would really find cell service, but they did. It wasn't strong, but it was adequate for them to call search and rescue. So they got some help on the way, and then they called my wife and told her what was happening. And then in the meantime, the physician was just there helping me. He tried to find some things that had some aspirin in it that he could give me. And I mean, he couldn't do much, but he did what he could. And then he just stayed there and kind of cared for me. And initially I wasn't feeling bad, just had that tired feeling.
And what was going through your mind at this time?
Well, at this stage, I was just trying to get my mind around it.
Uh-huh.
This isn't right.
Uh-huh.
I spent my whole life trying to stay in shape and avoid these kind of issues. I have some heart issues that are inherent in my family on both sides. And so I knew I was a little bit prone to it. So I'd try to maintain good health, eat right and manage my weight and stay active. I played basketball 2 or 3, 4 times a week and hiked and biked, and I was in good shape for a 60-year-old man. And this just shouldn't happen to somebody that's been doing that. And so that was what initially occurred to me, that this is just, are you even sure?
Right.
I'm having a heart attack. And he was. And so I just laid there and let him kind of take care of me. Then the hours started to go by. Even though they had called search and rescue and we had GPS units, so we gave them exact coordinates on where we were at, they didn't come. They didn't come. Tony hiked up and got cell service again and called again and asked what was going on. And they said, we can't find you. And then they finally called off the helicopter search.
Wow.
Because they just couldn't find us. And we had a ground team that was on the way and they couldn't find us. They got lost. And so it was probably 9 hours maybe.
Wow.
That I laid there on the mountain before they notified us that they were sending out another helicopter team. In the meantime, it was getting dark, that they had a team that had been certified for night rescues. And they didn't have any problem finding us. They flew right to the spot.
Wow. And
picked me up, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a second. But in the meantime, about 10 hours had passed. And in those 10 hours, I was slowly declining. And I could feel that. I reached a point probably 6 or 7 hours in, and I'm going, I can feel myself dying.
Wow.
That this is not a good feeling. That the life was just draining out of me and had less and less function. Started drifting in and out of consciousness. At that point, I got scared. I hadn't quite prepared myself to die. I felt like I had a good relationship with the Lord, and I didn't really felt like I had serious issues in my life, but I wasn't prepared to stand before the Savior and say, how'd I do? How was my life? It was a scary, very, very scary moment for me when I realized that I very likely wouldn't see my wife again and wouldn't see my kids and my grandkids in this life. And great anxiety came over me. And during those difficult feelings, I started kind of a long prayer, interacting with the Lord, and not necessarily asking that I would live. I felt like that whatever he needed me to do, that was okay. But to help me deal with whatever happened and help me understand a little bit better what was going on, and asking for his help to get through this. After I'd been praying for quite a little while, I just had an amazing experience. The anxiety left. It just faded. And I could feel the Spirit just enfolding me. It just like it was wrapping me up in a big warm cocoon. And all of the fear just dissipated and was gone. And he didn't communicate to me anything about maybe living through the process, but very, very distinctly, the concept came to me, not necessarily in words, but very clearly in concept. You, my son, are acceptable to me.
Oh, neat.
Excuse me. And all of the fear, all of the anxiety was gone. And I felt like whatever happened would be okay. It would be right. In the meantime, Tony and the other university person that was with me, who are both members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, laid their hands on me, and we have a process that we call a priesthood blessing, where they invoke the will of the Lord to heal or to do whatever needs to be done at that moment, whatever is revealed by the Spirit. In that blessing, they promised me that I would make it to medical care. And so along with the communication that I'd had with the Lord and this blessing, I felt like I was okay. Everything was good. The helicopter came. They lifted me out on a harness. And then the helicopter was short on fuel by this time, so they couldn't fly me all the way to the hospital. So they flew down and met a life flight and transferred me. And I remember lifting off in the second helicopter. Within a few short minutes, I went into a coma, and then don't remember anything for about 6 or 7 days.
Wow.
They flew me to Boise. They did a few things trying to resuscitate me a little. Actually, they did quite a bit, but they realized that they probably weren't going to be able to save my life. So they called the University of Utah Hospital, which has a premier cardiovascular clinic there. And as soon as I got to the hospital at the University of Utah, they put me on the table and began to try to evaluate the situation. As I flatlined. Took them 6 minutes to resuscitate me. And so I started this process at the University of Utah poorly. And at that point, the doctors really didn't have much hope for my survival. And if I survived, that's just too long to go without blood flow. Mm-hmm. So they figured I would have some very, very serious problems, maybe sufficient brain damage that I would never come back to consciousness. But they put me on an artificial heart-lung machine and put all kinds of tubes and put me on a respirator. And we did some counting. I had 21 tubes inserted into me. Wow. My wife arrived shortly after that in crisis. Mm-hmm. She was having a very difficult time through this. Mm-hmm. In fact, she had a lot harder time than I did. I was in the ICU for more than a month.
Wow.
A long, long recovery process filled with all kinds of little wonderful incidents and miracles. But I'll share with you one more thing that happened. When I woke up from my coma, and I was in tough shape, my brain wasn't working right. I'd had major multiple organ failure. Mm-hmm. As I can tell, the only thing that was working in my body was my liver. Everything else quit working. Wow. Even my skin quit working.
Wow.
It was not a good situation.
Was it pretty painful, the whole situation?
Not terribly painful, just terribly frustrating. Uh-huh. They did give me a little pain medication at first, but it really wasn't so much to resolve pain issues as it was to reduce anxiety.
Yeah.
Just to help me
stay calm and
calm and kind of make it through the process. Mm-hmm. But I had lots of other things. Kidneys had failed and I was on dialysis. Couldn't eat. My digestive system wasn't functional. I couldn't swallow. I had all the symptoms of a left side stroke, and so the right side of my body was non-functional. Mm-hmm. My brain was just shattered. I couldn't concentrate on anything for more than a few seconds. I couldn't talk, couldn't write because I'm right-handed and my right arm wouldn't work. I couldn't communicate with anybody. I was in tough shape.
Yeah.
And it was a difficult time for me and difficult for everybody that was around me. Mm-hmm. But I could hear. Mm-hmm. And after about 6 days, I opened my eyes and I could actually see a little bit. It was real fuzzy, but I could see that my wife was there in the room. But I couldn't say anything to her, couldn't really even move, just laid and looked at her. Mm-hmm. She didn't really even know I was there, but she did at some point in that little period of time. She looked over me and she says, "I'm not sure what I think he's looking at me."
Oh, uh-huh.
And so that was about the point where all of my brothers and sisters came to be with me. And I mentioned a priesthood blessing. My brothers all put their hands on my head and again gave me a priesthood blessing. And the blessing that my brother gave me was absolutely remarkable. And I can remember most of the words very clearly, even though I didn't have very good brain function. Mm-hmm. He promised me that I would return to be with my wife and my children and my grandchildren, that I would function and have a normal life, that I would return to the activities and things that I love and the physical things, playing some basketball, going hiking, going fishing, doing all the things that I love to do. And he said, those things will all be yours again. This is my next youngest brother, and my brother just younger than him. After they finished this blessing, he grabbed him by the front of the shirt and said, "Are you serious?
What are you thinking?
What are you thinking? Did you look at him? Wow. If he makes it through the next 2 days, we're going to be lucky."
Wow. Uh-huh.
And of course, my brother that gave the blessing, he said, "I wouldn't have said that. Those were not my words. Mm-hmm. Those are the words that came to me through the Spirit. And so I will stand by those words, because I'm not just trying to make it up and say what I would like to have happen."
Yeah.
It turned out that blessing was very critical, not just because of what the Lord was promising, but because of the decisions that I had to make. Mm-hmm. I made it through the first 2 weeks, and that was almost entirely because I was on an artificial heart-lung machine that was basically doing all of the work that my heart could no longer do. So they were artificially keeping me alive, but I made it through 2 weeks. And at the end of those 2 weeks, they said, we need to give you some options. They said, if we don't do anything and we begin to remove you from this support equipment, it's our feeling that we probably won't live very long, just a matter of days.
Wow.
So we've got a new technology that we call the LVAD system. That stands for left ventricle assist device. And it's basically an artificial heart. And they said, would you like us to put in this LVAD pump? We think it will help you. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. And everything that I mentioned before was happening to me. I was basically an invalid because my body wasn't functional. And so they said, what would you like to do? And I said, well, if you put that in, is there any chance I'll recover some of these bodily functions that are essential to living? Or am I going to have to just be cared for as an invalid for the rest of my life?
Right.
And they said, we don't know. It's just a decision you're going to have to make and hope it was the right one. Mm-hmm. So my wife and I talked about it at length, and I didn't want to leave her with a cripple to care for the rest of her life. She didn't need that. So I was actually very seriously considering, I'm just saying, no, don't worry about it. Just let me go. Mm-hmm. And she didn't want to.
Right.
And so we started reflecting on that blessing my brother had given me. And we were going, well, we got to do our part to give that blessing a chance. Mm-hmm. If we don't do this, there's probably no chance. So it seems like based on what was given to us from the Lord, this is the right decision. Let's let him do it. And so they did, put in the LVAD. And now I carry a pouch with a battery pack and a controller, and got a tube that goes into my abdomen, and it feeds electricity to that pump and pumps my blood around because my heart can't do it. Through, again, another series of miracles, I gained basically everything I lost back. It took 6 months before I was ready to come back to work. It took more than a year before I had enough energy to work 8 hours and then go home and do anything but just crash. It's been 2 years now. Now I go home and spend a couple hours working in my garden, and been on some fairly significant 5-6 mile hikes, and I'm a little slower than I used to be because the artificial heart doesn't speed up when you're doing hard work. So I just have to kind of pace myself and go a little slower. And I played a little basketball, basically fulfilled all the promises that were given through my brother from the Lord. And I'm on the heart transplant list, and I'm hoping that will come about pretty soon. And that will be kind of the final step in my recovery. I will tell you just a couple other things, I think, because it's pertinent to the spiritual side of what's happened to me. 2 things came primarily from that experience on the mountain with the Lord and with the Spirit, and the communication that came to me at that point. One is that I have absolutely no fear of death. I don't think anybody could go through that kind of experience and not have that happen. Whenever my death comes, I'm good to go.
And do you feel that way because of the comfort you felt and the message that you're acceptable to me?
That's a big, big part of it. And the other part of it is I've been halfway there.
Yeah.
But anyway, the other thing is I've always been kind of an empathetic person. I feel people's emotions really easily. Mm-hmm. Because of that, I was always concerned about what people think of me and what I should do, because I don't want to disappoint them or do whatever. Mm-hmm. This is kind of the amazing thing, because I can't really tell you why this happened. But after that experience, I have absolutely no caring of what people think of me. I don't care. I don't care what you think. I don't care what my mom thinks. Mm-hmm. I only care what the Savior thinks. Mm-hmm. I still feel those emotions from people. I still have charity towards people, I think, in a pretty good way. But it's not a burden to you. There is no personal impact from you to me if you don't think I'm doing things right, because I don't care. It's an amazingly liberating
I was going to say emotion. A sense of freedom.
It is.
Yeah.
And I've actually been very grateful for it. Now what I'm doing with my life is trying to figure out what to do with that.
Yeah.
Because it changes the way you feel about things and subsequently do things.
Right. Your motivation is different.
The motivation is very different. Mm-hmm. And so I'm learning to grow through that. But everybody ought to go through that. It's a great experience.
I've had glimpses of that. And, when you're out of your ego for moments, you go, oh, how freedom to feel, not worry about what other people are thinking or to have to feel a sense of duty to someone else because they might think this or that about you. So I've had
Yep.
glimpses of that, but it hasn't been sustainable. So, which is very liberating when you feel that.
It was sudden, sharp, and permanent.
Nice.
I thought maybe that would fade too, but it hasn't faded a bit.
That's wonderful. I love that. What do you think contributed to your survival? Prayer or these blessings? Were there things that you think were major contributors to that?
I very strongly feel, and part of it's because of some of the communications that occurred with the Lord through this process. I feel that the Lord was watching out for me 2 or 3 weeks before that trip.
Mm-hmm.
He could see what was coming. He made sure that the people and the things that were around me were the things that would contribute to that survival. Mm-hmm. And of course, I think he cared for me. And sometimes when I was really struggling in the hospital even, and I'm going, how can I live without a functional kidney? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I've been on dialysis for 6 weeks, and the doctors, when they come in, won't even hardly look at me because they don't think my kidneys will ever work again because it's just been too long. And I talked with the Lord and said, I'm doing this partly because of what you told me. I ask for your help once again. And a day or two later, my kidneys start to function. And
that's amazing.
It was a combination of the things that were around me, the people that were around me. But I think the Lord had a hand even in that. In some cases, his personal intervention.
Mm-hmm. And orchestrating the right people at the right time and place for you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The 3 people that were with me are the 3 people that could have done what happened.
Yeah. So has your relationship with the Lord changed since then?
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. My emotions are pretty deep. And even since then, when they put somebody with this heart device on the heart transplant team, they allow you a 1-month opportunity to be on the top of the transplant list and hopefully get a transplant fairly early in your treatment. So I did that about a year after my heart attack, and I had to go down and stay next to the hospital for a month, be on the top of the transplant list. And I waited through most of that month, and I was about 2 days from the end of the month, and I'm going, I don't think this is going to happen. Mm-hmm. And it was a very emotional moment for me because I had such high hopes that we would be able to complete this healing process and get me back on top of things. And so I fasted and approached the Lord in very fervent prayer and said, I don't know how to deal with this, but I will bow to your will. But if it's okay in these last couple of days, it'd be nice if a heart came along. But during that moment of prayer, again, very clearly, the words came to me. This is the way I interpreted the message that came, because it didn't come in words. It came in concept. Mm-hmm. He says, I've got your back. Don't worry about it. And so ever since then, I'm another year away from all of that. I've been waiting, but it's not a hard wait because I know whatever's happening is being directed by the Lord.
Well, it sounds like you're in a process of learning, maybe through this time, learning to surrender and trust and just know that the Lord is with you through this whole thing.
Yeah. There was so much of this that I was helpless to fix. Mm-hmm. I've always been the fix-it guy, Couldn't fix this.
Yeah.
So I had to bow to his will.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing this and being with us. I know your experiences will help others and touch others. Just beautiful experiences, personal times with the Lord. And I really appreciate you sharing that. So thank you.
Yep. You're sure welcome, Liza.
So there you have it. I must say that I felt very reverent listening to this story and interviewing Steve, especially that beautiful personal message from the Lord that you, my son, are acceptable to me. Can you imagine having that reassurance and that personal message conveyed to you from the Lord? I think that's so powerful. And Steve, we sure hope and pray that you receive a heart soon. I know you've been waiting. You're on the transplant list. I'd like to offer prayers in your behalf, and if anyone wants to join me, that would be amazing and wonderful. So for my listeners, thanks for spending some time with me this week. Join me next week for more miracle moments. Next week's episode involves a mother's worst nightmare, hearing that your child has been run over by a car. So subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss that one. I would also love your support in spreading the word about wonders and miracles. The best way to do that is to give this podcast a rating, write a review, subscribe to the podcast, share it with your family and friends on your social media or through email. I'd love to inspire and uplift as many people as we can, but I can't do that without your help and support. One more quick shout out to our sponsor, Meditations on the Mount. I hope that you can find peace in abiding in the presence of God through these beautiful meditations, and perhaps you're ready to take a meditation course. If you'd like to be on the show, submit a story on wondersandmiracles.com. And like Spencer W. Kimball said, God does notice us. He watches over us, but it is usually through another person that He meets our needs. I hope we can all think of a time when you saw God watching over you in your life. And as always, remember to notice and celebrate the miracles everywhere, because the more miracles we notice, the more miracles happen.